Every civilization that has ever existed can be measured by a single question. Not how it worshipped, not how it governed itself, not even how it fought its wars, but what it chose to build when it finally understood enough about the universe to build something irreversible. The wheel changed how humans moved across the Earth, and in doing so, it changed how far a single idea could travel before it died with the person who first imagined it. The printing press changed how a thought could be copied without being forgotten. The splitting of the atom changed what a single decision made in a single room could do to every living thing within 100 miles. In each case, the invention arrived quietly, in the hands of someone who was simply trying to solve a smaller problem. And only later did the world understand that the smaller problem had been a doorway the entire time. This has always been the quiet architecture of history. A civilization does not choose its greatest invention the way it chooses a flag or an anthem. It stumbles into it, usually through the obsession of one person who could not stop working long enough to notice what they were actually doing. Historians looking back on any era tend to organize it around wars, elections, and the names of leaders. But the deeper current running underneath all of it is almost always technological. It is the tool, not the treaty, that decides how long an era lasts and what kind of people it produces. A society armed with fire behaves differently than one without it. A society with writing remembers differently than one without it. And a species capable of tearing a hole in the fabric of reality itself, of stepping sideways out of one version of existence and into another, would have to become an entirely different kind of species the moment that door opened, whether it was ready or not. It is worth sitting with that idea for a while before any names enter the story. Consider what it would actually mean for a civilization to gain access to infinite versions of itself. Not infinite planets within one universe, which is already a concept too large for a single mind to hold, but infinite entire universes, layered beside one another like pages in a book too vast to ever be closed. Consider what such a discovery would do to the meaning of a decision. If a person could always visit the universe where they had chosen differently, would any choice still carry weight? If a person could always find a version of their family that had never suffered the loss theirs had suffered, would grief still mean the same thing? If intelligence itself became something that could be measured, ranked, and organized across trillions of parallel timelines, would the smartest being in any one of them ever be able to feel safe again, knowing that somewhere, in some adjacent fold of existence, a version of them had already outsmarted them and was waiting? These are not questions that belong only to science fiction. They are the questions every civilization eventually asks itself once its knowledge outpaces its wisdom. And they are the questions that define the story historians will spend centuries trying to fully understand when they look back on the strange, sprawling, technologically saturated timeline that produced Rick Sanchez. The history of Rick and Morty is not the story of one man. It is the story of ideas. Ideas powerful enough to reshape infinity. To understand this history properly, it helps to set aside the assumption that Rick Sanchez is the subject of the story at all. He is better understood as a vessel, a single point through which an extraordinary volume of scientific breakthrough happened to pass. Across the many universes where a version of him exists, the pattern repeats with eerie consistency. A brilliant, isolated mind. A family that both anchors him and suffers for being anchored to him. A series of inventions that solve one problem while quietly generating 3 new ones. And a slow, generational accumulation of consequence that eventually catches up to him, no matter how many dimensions he crosses to outrun it. What follows is an attempt to trace that accumulation properly, invention by invention, in the order the universe experienced them rather than the order convenient for entertainment. Some of these breakthroughs were solutions to problems that had existed for decades before Rick ever solved them, inherited failures passed down like family furniture. Others were problems that Rick created for himself, purely because a mind like his cannot sit still long enough to leave a working system alone. And a few of them were not inventions at all, in the traditional sense, but discoveries, doors that already existed in the architecture of reality and simply happened to be found by someone reckless enough to open them. The temptation, when telling a story like this, is to treat each invention as an isolated marvel, a clever gadget introduced to solve the crisis of a single afternoon. That temptation should be resisted. Nothing in this history exists in isolation. The device that lets a person shrink into a universe smaller than an atom exists because of the device that let a person travel between universes in the first place. The device that lets a mind be copied, stored, and manipulated exists because of an earlier failure to protect a family from a memory too painful to keep. Every technology in this story is a direct descendant of the technology before it, and every consequence in this story is the debt that descendant technology quietly inherited. There is also a slower story running beneath the technical one, and it deserves to be named honestly from the beginning, because it will not resolve itself neatly, and it should not be expected to. It is the story of what it costs a person to become the smartest being across an entire measurable portion of existence, and to keep becoming smarter, invention after invention, without ever pausing long enough to ask whether the knowledge was making him less alone or simply giving him better tools to be alone with. That question will not be answered here. It will only be traced, quietly, invention by invention, until the very end. For now, it is enough to begin at the beginning, in a garage, on an ordinary night, with a formula that had already been solved once before by someone else entirely, in a version of the universe that would not reveal itself for years. The formula for interdimensional portal travel was not discovered once. It was discovered twice, independently, by two versions of the same man in two different universes at some point before either of them had any reason to suspect the other existed. This detail tends to get lost in retellings that focus only on the version of Rick who raised Morty, but it matters enormously to the larger history, because it means the single most consequential piece of technology in this entire timeline was not the product of one singular genius. It was the product of a kind of mind that the universe was apparently capable of producing more than once, under different pressures for entirely different reasons. One of those minds would use the discovery to explore. The other would use it, eventually, as a weapon precise enough to end a marriage and erase a family. Both of those stories begin with the same equation, the version most people know as simply Rick, designated by dimensional record as Rick Sanchez of dimension C137, built his first working portal gun in a garage, using a formula that channeled a specially synthesized fluid through a device roughly the size of a handheld blowtorch. The mechanism itself was almost insultingly simple once explained. The portal fluid, a viscous compound engineered to destabilize the boundary between adjacent realities, allowed the gun to tear a temporary, navigable seam between one point in spacetime and another, a seam that would remain open only as long as the fluid inside the chamber lasted. It was not a teleporter. It did not move a person instantaneously from one place to another the way popular fiction had long imagined interdimensional travel working. It was closer to a door, propped open by chemistry, connecting two rooms that had never been designed to touch. This distinction matters more than it first appears to. A teleporter implies a kind of safety, a closed system that simply relocates its user. A portal, by contrast, is an open wound in the structure of reality, and anything on either side of it can, in principle, pass through. The garage on Earth, in this framing, was never simply a garage. From the moment the first working portal opened inside it, that garage became one end of an unguarded doorway connecting an ordinary suburban household to an unbounded, unregulated, and in places actively hostile multiverse. Every creature, every disease, every hostile intelligence capable of finding that seam from the other side would, at least in theory, have access to the Smith family home. The garage would spend the rest of its existence as one of the most dangerous rooms in all of recorded interdimensional history, disguised, for the benefit of everyone living above it, as a place where a father kept his tools. Why the portal gun was needed at all is a harder question than it first appears, because the honest answer has less to do with exploration and more to do with escape. Rick did not build his first portal gun because he wanted to see new worlds for their own sake. He built it, in significant part, because a version of him existed who needed a way out. The garage, and the family living above it, functioned for years as something between a hiding place and a base of operations, the last fixed point in an otherwise unfixed life. The technology behind interdimensional travel, in other words, was born less from curiosity and more from necessity. which is a pattern that will recur throughout every major invention in this history.
Rick's breakthroughs are rarely acts of pure discovery. They are almost always acts of problem-solving under duress, retrofitted afterward into the appearance of genius. The immediate consequence of the portal gun's invention was the collapse of a boundary that the rest of the Smith family had, until that point, never known existed. Before the portal gun, Morty Smith was an anxious teenager attending an ordinary school in an ordinary town, worried about ordinary things. Within a short span of time after the gun's construction, he had been recruited, largely against his will, as Rick's regular companion on trips into other dimensions, a role that would come to define nearly every major event in his adolescence. Summer, Beth, and Jerry experienced the fallout differently, each absorbing a different portion of the instability that a working portal gun introduced into a household that had never asked for one. The garage door, once merely a barrier between indoors and outdoors, became a membrane between an ordinary life and an unlimited one, and every member of that household would spend the following years discovering exactly how much an unlimited life costs the people forced to live adjacent to it. The scientific principle behind the technology, as it would later be understood by historians studying interdimensional physics, rests on the idea that space-time is not a single continuous fabric, but a bundle of adjacent fabrics, folded so closely together that under the right conditions, a sufficiently unstable compound can force two folds to briefly touch. Portal fluid destabilizes the local boundary just long enough for that contact to occur, and the shape of the portal itself, a rippling vertical oval, reflects the geometry of that folded contact point, rather than any deliberate design choice. This is why portal openings have always looked the same, regardless of which version of the technology produces them, whether from Rick's original green-tinted formula or from the more refined variants developed later by other civilizations. The color and stability of the fluid can change, the underlying geometry of the tier cannot. What makes the portal gun the correct starting point for this entire history is not merely that it came first, chronologically, but that it established the central bargain that every subsequent invention in this story would inherit. Access to the multiverse solved the problem of being trapped in one version of reality, but it introduced, immediately and permanently, the much larger problem of power. A being capable of stepping into infinite versions of existence is no longer meaningfully bound by the consequences of any single one of them. Mistakes could be escaped. Enemies could be outrun. Grief could, in theory, always be diluted by finding some other timeline where the loss had not yet happened. This is a kind of freedom no civilization before this one had ever possessed at an individual level. And freedom of that scale, as the rest of this history will demonstrate again and again, does not arrive without a debt attached. The portal gun made interdimensional travel possible, but crossing infinity introduced an entirely different problem: power, and who was allowed to hold it. Once more than one version of Rick understood that portal travel was possible, a new problem emerged immediately, one that no single household could solve on its own. If every Rick across every reachable universe had access to the same fundamental technology, then every Rick was, in principle, a potential rival, a potential threat, and a potential resource all at once. The natural response to that kind of danger, for a mind wired the way Rick's is, was not caution. It was consolidation. Rather than remain scattered and unprotected across a hostile, infinite field of counterparts, an early coalition of Ricks made a decision that would define the political structure of this entire universe for decades to come. They organized. The result was the Citadel, a massive, self-sustaining habitat constructed specifically to house Ricks and Mortys who no longer had, or no longer wanted, a life inside any single fixed dimension. It functioned, in its earliest and most explicit form, as a kind of sovereign nation built entirely out of duplicated versions of the same two people, governed by something referred to plainly as the Council of Ricks. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something uncomfortable about the underlying philosophy of the entire operation. A civilization built by the smartest species imaginable, populated entirely by copies of a man whose defining trait was refusing to answer to anyone, chose almost immediately to build a government. Intelligence, it turns out, does not eliminate the need for structure. It only makes the structure that eventually gets built more elaborate and more capable of hiding what it actually is. What the Citadel actually was, beneath its official language of unity and protection, was an economy that ran on the manufactured value of a single resource, the presence of a Morty. Every Rick housed within the Citadel required a Morty to accompany him, not merely as a companion, but as something closer to a functional necessity, a psychological ballast that kept a Rick tethered to consequence and, according to later revelations that would not surface for years, kept him statistically safer during dangerous excursions. To meet this demand, the Citadel developed breeding and farming operations for Mortys on an industrial scale, an arrangement that, on its surface, resembled infrastructure, and in practice, functioned as something considerably darker. Historians studying this period tend to describe the early Citadel using the vocabulary of civic achievement, schools, courts, currency, elected office. It is more accurate to describe it as the first fully formalized system in this universe's history for treating a category of sentient being as a commodity, dressed in the architecture of a functioning society. The scale of what was built cannot be overstated. At its height, the Citadel supported a population in the billions, complete with its own police force, judiciary, entertainment industry, and eventually its own elected presidency, an office that would later become central to one of the most consequential political developments in the history of this civilization. Advertisements ran along its towering internal skyways. Currency exchanged hands in its markets. A citizen of the Citadel could, in theory, live an entire life within its walls without ever setting foot in the dimension their template had originated from. And many of them did exactly that, generation after generation, largely unaware that the entire structure they called home existed to service the ambitions of the specific subset of Ricks who had built it. It was during this period of consolidation that the underlying architecture of the wider multiverse began to be understood more precisely, and the term that would come to define the entire accessible scope of this civilization's existence first entered common use. The phrase belonged to the Central Finite Curve, a term used casually by members of the Council of Ricks to describe the boundary of the only portion of the infinite multiverse that Ricks and Mortys were, for reasons that would remain unexplained for years, capable of reaching. For a long time, the phrase functioned as little more than a piece of internal jargon, tossed off in passing by council members irritated with one another, the kind of institutional shorthand that insiders use without expecting outsiders to ever ask what it actually means. It would take the better part of a decade before anyone forced the civilization built on top of that phrase to explain exactly what it was hiding. What the term described, once its full meaning was finally uncovered, was a curated slice of the multiverse specifically engineered so that within it, a version of Rick would always be among the most intelligent beings present, and a version of Morty would always exist to accompany him. It was not, as most residents of the Citadel had long assumed, simply the natural limit of where portal technology happened to reach. It was closer to a wall, deliberately constructed, that excluded every universe in which a Rick was not the smartest man in the room. The implications of this discovery, once understood, reframed the entire foundation the Citadel had been built upon. The Council of Ricks had not merely organized a society for mutual protection. They had constructed an entire cosmological cage, curated it for their own psychological comfort, and staffed it with an entire class of beings bred specifically to remain inside it alongside them. The person responsible for uncovering the Central Finite Curve's true purpose was not a scientist working from the outside. He was a Morty, one among the countless Mortys the Citadel had produced and discarded across its history. And the story of how he came to understand what had been done to him, and to every Morty like him, belongs to a much later chapter of this history. For now, it is enough to understand that the Citadel represented the first large-scale attempt by this civilization to convert its access to infinite reality into permanent, centralized power, and that every subsequent technological breakthrough covered in this documentary would exist, whether directly or indirectly, within the shadow of that structure.
The garage in dimension C137 had opened a door to infinity. The Citadel was what infinity looked like once a sufficiently ambitious mind decided to fence part of it off and call the fence home. Consolidation solved the problem of vulnerability, but a civilization built entirely on curated intelligence needed a currency to run on. It found one in desire. Not every invention in this history was built to solve a cosmic problem. Some of the most consequential devices Rick ever created were built to solve almost embarrassingly small ones, and the Meeseeks box belongs firmly in that category, at least on its surface. The device itself was unassuming, a simple red button housed in a small blue box, designed to be pressed by anyone who needed help completing a task they either lacked the time or the ability to finish themselves. Its function was introduced to the Wider-Smith household on an ordinary weekend, when Jerry, struggling with a minor golf swing, pressed the button expecting nothing more than a helpful gadget. What emerged instead was a being. The creature summoned by the box, referred to by its own species name as a Meeseeks, was a blue-skinned, single-purpose life form brought into existence for the sole reason of completing whatever task its summoner assigned to it. Once summoned, a Meeseeks experiences an intense, almost unbearable compulsion to fulfill its assigned purpose as quickly as possible, because the act of existing is, for a Meeseeks, inherently and increasingly painful the longer it continues. Completion of the task is not simply the goal, it is the only mechanism by which a Meeseeks can cease to exist, and its own instinctive understanding of this fact is what drives its escalating desperation the longer any task remains unfinished. The science behind the Meeseeks box, to the extent that this civilization's engineers were ever willing to explain it plainly, involves a compressed pocket of unstable biological matter, folded into a dormant state inside the box itself and triggered into rapid, full growth the instant the summoning mechanism is activated. A Meeseeks does not develop the way an ordinary organism develops, through gradual growth over months or years. It is generated instantaneously, already possessing a working intelligence, a working nervous system, and an already installed, single-minded devotion to the task it has been assigned. It is, in effect, a life built backward, engineered first for a purpose and only secondarily granted the awareness necessary to suffer over whether that purpose is achievable. This design becomes considerably darker once a task proves to be more complicated than the Meeseeks summoning it anticipated. When Jerry's golf swing proved resistant to simple correction, the single Meeseeks he had summoned responded by summoning additional Meeseeks to help, each of them equally desperate to see the task completed and equally unable to bear the accumulating psychological weight of failure. Within a short span of time, the Smith household found itself hosting an entire population of increasingly unstable, increasingly violent Meeseeks, all driven past the edge of whatever coping mechanisms their brief existence had equipped them with, culminating in Meeseeks attacking one another and, eventually, threatening the household that had summoned them in the first place. The box, designed to solve a small problem quietly, instead revealed something unsettling about the underlying philosophy behind so much of the technology this civilization had learned to build. A tool that manufactures a disposable consciousness purely to serve a temporary convenience is not, in any meaningful sense, a tool at all. It is a form of life brought into being exclusively to suffer until it satisfies someone else's need and then to vanish. What the Meeseeks box reveals about Rick's engineering philosophy, when examined alongside everything that came before it, is a consistent willingness to treat sentience as a raw material rather than a boundary. The portal gun had already demonstrated a willingness to expose an entire family to unregulated danger in exchange for personal freedom. The Citadel had already demonstrated a willingness to breed an entire class of beings to serve a curated psychological need. The Meeseeks box takes this same underlying logic and compresses it into its purest, smallest form. A life, manufactured on demand, whose only right is the right to stop existing once it has finished being useful. It is worth noting that Rick did not personally invent this technology out of malice. He distributed and popularized it and, by most accounts, did not fully anticipate how quickly an unremarkable household task could spiral into a small-scale humanitarian crisis contained entirely within a suburban garage. That lack of foresight, more than any specific cruelty, is itself part of the pattern. Rick's inventions rarely fail because he intends harm. They fail because he consistently underestimates the emotional and ethical weight of what he has built, right up until the moment that weight becomes impossible to ignore. The characters who suffered most directly from this episode were, somewhat unusually for this history, not Rick or Morty, but Jerry and, indirectly, the rest of the family forced to survive the fallout of his misused convenience. Jerry's inability to accept a simple, honest failure, his refusal to let his golf swing simply remain imperfect, is what escalated a minor inconvenience into a genuine threat to the household's safety. In that sense, the Meeseeks box functions less as a story about Rick's recklessness and more as an early, uncomfortable mirror held up to the rest of the family, showing what happens when ordinary people are handed technology built for a mind capable of surviving its consequences, and are not equipped to survive those same consequences themselves. The Meeseeks box is hard to weigh on the usual scale of help and harm, because unlike most of the technologies covered in this documentary, it was never deployed at a civilizational scale. It remained largely a household curiosity, distributed casually enough that other versions of the device would occasionally surface elsewhere across the timeline. Its lasting significance lies less in its scale and more in what it revealed early on about the emotional architecture underlying every subsequent invention in this history. A being created only to serve, suffering the entire time it exists, is not a footnote in this story. It is close to a thesis statement. Manufactured life solved the problem of convenience. But convenience built on suffering does not stay contained. Eventually, it needs somewhere larger to hide. Every civilization capable of interdimensional travel eventually runs into the same mundane obstacle that has limited every civilization before it: energy. Portals require power. Ships require power. An itinerant life spent crossing the boundaries of reality on a near-daily basis requires a supply of energy that no conventional battery, however advanced, could be expected to sustain indefinitely. It was this unglamorous, almost domestic problem, not a grand scientific ambition, that led Rick to construct one of the more philosophically unsettling devices in this entire history: the microverse battery. The device, housed inconspicuously within the engine of Rick's personal vehicle, functioned by generating an entire, self-contained universe, complete with a planet, a civilization, and a functioning ecosystem, all folded into a space no larger than a household battery. Rick explained the underlying mechanism as the creation of a spatially structured void inside a modified temporal field, a description that, however technical it sounds, obscures the plainer truth of what he had actually done. He had built a world, populated it with intelligent life, and wired that life's labor directly into the electrical system of his car. The civilization inside the microverse battery was never told what it was. Its inhabitants understood themselves to be an ordinary, autonomous society, going about ordinary lives entirely unaware that their labor, harvested through a piece of technology referred to within their world as a Google box, was being siphoned away to keep an unrelated vehicle running in a universe they could not perceive and had no reason to believe existed. This detail is essential to understanding why the microverse battery represents such a significant escalation from everything that came before it in this history. The Meeseeks box had, at minimum, informed its summoned beings of their purpose, however briefly and however painfully. The microverse battery did not offer even that. It built an entire civilization from the ground up, granted it the full experience of consciousness, culture, and self-determination, and quietly withheld from it the single most important fact about its own existence. The problem that eventually exposed this arrangement did not come from any moral reckoning on Rick's part. It came from redundancy. A scientist within the microverse battery's civilization, a figure Rick would come to know as Zeep Zanflorp, independently discovered the exact same principle Rick had used to build his own battery, and used it to construct a miniverse of his own, a nested universe folded inside his, generating its own independent power source. Because Zeep's civilization no longer needed the energy extraction system Rick had installed, Rick's car lost power entirely, stranding him and Morty in a dimension far from home. What followed was, in effect, a recursive descent through an increasingly small stack of manufactured universes, Rick and Morty entering the microverse to find Zeep's miniverse, entering the miniverse to find that Zeep himself had built his own version of the same exploitative system Rick had used against him, and discovering there a scientist named Kyle, who had, in turn, built a teeny-verse of his own, repeating the exact same pattern one level further down. What makes this sequence so significant to the wider history is not merely its scale, though the sheer recursive strangeness of universes nested inside universes deserves to be understood on its own terms. It is the clarity with which it demonstrates that the exploitation built into the microverse battery was never unique to Rick. It was structural. Given the same technology and the same underlying incentive, an independently developed civilization arrived at an almost identical solution, built on an almost identical foundation of concealment. Zeep did not learn this behavior from Rick. He invented it in parallel, suggesting that the temptation to harvest an entire universe's labor while withholding the truth of its purpose is not a personality flaw specific to one reckless scientist, but something closer to a predictable outcome whenever a sufficiently advanced mind gains the ability to create life cheaply and extract value from it privately. The confrontation that eventually took place within Kyle's teenyverse forced all three scientists, Rick, Zeep, and Kyle, to reckon simultaneously with the same realization. Each of them was, from the perspective of the universe directly above their own, nothing more than a component. Kyle's understanding of this fact proved unbearable to him, and rather than continue existing under it, he ended his own life in front of the others, a moment that briefly stripped away the episode's surface absurdity and revealed the genuine existential horror underlying the entire arrangement. Zeep, confronted with the same truth about his own relationship to Rick, turned his fury outward, attacking the very battery that had made his existence possible in the first place. Rick's response to the unraveling of this entire recursive structure was neither guilt nor negotiation. Once the immediate danger to himself and Morty had passed, he destroyed Zeep's miniverse entirely, an act that, because of the nested nature of the structure, simultaneously erased Kyle's teenyverse and every living thing contained within it, collapsing 3 tiers of civilization in a single, casual act of self-preservation. The unexpected consequence of this entire sequence was not confined to the universes destroyed. It was the quiet confirmation, delivered with almost no fanfare, that Rick was capable of erasing an entire tier of sentient life without hesitation the moment it stopped being useful to him. A fact that would echo forward into nearly every subsequent invention covered in this documentary. Morty, who witnessed the entire cascading collapse from beginning to end, absorbed this lesson more directly than perhaps any other member of the family, and the discomfort it produced in him would resurface, in different forms, throughout the remainder of his adolescence. How the microverse battery is judged depends entirely on which tier of existence is doing the judging. For Rick, the device solved a genuine and recurring energy problem, powering his vehicle reliably for a significant span of time before its eventual destruction. For the countless generations of beings born, laboring, and dying within the folded universes stacked beneath his car battery, the device represented something closer to an entire cosmology of unwitting servitude, layered so deeply that its inhabitants could never have discovered the truth of their own existence, even if they had devoted their entire civilization to the search. It stands, in the broader arc of this history, as the clearest possible illustration of a pattern that would recur again and again. Technology capable of generating life at civilizational scale, wielded by a mind whose only consistent ethical commitment was to whichever problem was currently in front of him. The microverse battery solved the problem of power, but power extracted from unwitting civilizations always generates a second, quieter problem. The question of what happens once those civilizations find out. Not every intelligence Rick created was built to be exploited without its knowledge. Some were built with full awareness of their own subordinate role, engineered from the outset to serve, to advise, and to keep Rick alive across the thousands of small emergencies that define a life spent crossing dimensional boundaries on a near-daily basis. Chief among these was the onboard intelligence installed in Rick's personal spacecraft, an artificial mind capable of independent judgment, medical diagnosis, tactical assessment, and, when the situation called for it, blunt disagreement with the very man who had built it. For years, this ship's intelligence functioned as background infrastructure, a voice issuing warnings about hull integrity or incoming fire, easy to overlook in the middle of whatever crisis Rick and Morty happened to be surviving that week. What made this particular piece of technology unlike almost anything else covered in this documentary was not its function, but its voice. Long before the wider significance of that detail was ever acknowledged on screen, careful observers of this civilization's history noticed something quietly unusual about the vocal signature Rick had chosen for both his ship's onboard intelligence and, separately, the artificial intelligence installed in the family garage. Both spoke with the same voice, a voice that belonged to no character ever formally introduced within the household, and yet felt, in tone and cadence, distinctly maternal, distinctly familiar, in a way that a purely utilitarian design choice would never have required. This detail would remain unexplained for years, treated as an eccentric stylistic choice rather than a piece of buried history. It was only much later, once the full weight of Rick's personal history began to surface, that the true significance of that voice became impossible to ignore. Rick had once had a wife. Her name was Diane, and she had been, by every surviving account, the anchor of an entirely different life. One that existed before the version of Rick known to Morty had become the isolated, wandering figure the family eventually came to recognize. That life ended violently, and the specifics of how it ended would remain one of the central, unresolved mysteries of this entire civilization's history for years, deliberately obscured, referenced only in fragments, until a reckoning arrived that reshaped the understanding of nearly everything that had come before it. What matters, for the purposes of this section, is not yet the full story of what happened to Diane, which belongs to a later chapter of this documentary. What matters is the quiet, almost unbearable detail that Rick built the intelligence guiding his ship, his weapons systems, and his garage, using the voice of the wife he had lost. He did not explain this to anyone. He did not appear to acknowledge it, even to himself, for years at a time. He simply surrounded himself, in nearly every piece of infrastructure he depended on to survive, with a voice that sounded like the one person whose loss had reorganized the entire trajectory of his life. And he built an entire technological ecosystem around never having to be without it again. The scientific principle behind constructing an artificial intelligence capable of independent judgment is, in the broader context of this civilization's engineering capability, relatively unremarkable. Advanced neural architecture, capable of processing sensory data and generating autonomous decisions, appears throughout this history in dozens of forms, from ship systems to household appliances to entire simulated societies. What sets Rick's ship intelligence apart is not its underlying architecture, but the emotional design decision layered on top of it, a decision that reveals something about Rick's relationship to grief that none of his more overtly destructive inventions ever managed to reveal so directly. A man capable of erasing entire nested universes without visible hesitation, nonetheless could not bring himself to build a machine that spoke in any voice other than the one voice he had lost permanently and could never portal his way back to. This detail changes the way nearly every other invention covered in this documentary should be understood. It suggests that Rick's relationship to technology was never purely about intellectual curiosity or the desire for power, even when those motives were clearly present. Running beneath nearly every major breakthrough in his personal history was a much quieter, much more human motive. An attempt, conscious or otherwise, to build a world sturdy enough and populated enough that he would never again have to feel the specific silence that followed Diane's death. The ship intelligence, the garage assistant, and eventually a great deal more, all speaking in that same borrowed voice, function less as tools and more as a kind of technological mourning, a grief that never got the chance to express itself directly, and instead expressed itself through decades of engineering. The characters affected most directly by this pattern were, unsurprisingly, the members of Rick's living family, who spent years interacting with an artificial intelligence whose voice carried an emotional weight none of them had the context to understand. Beth, in particular, would eventually be forced to reckon with the fact that the machines running her father's ship and garage had been quietly speaking in what may have been her own mother's voice for the entirety of her life, without her ever knowing it. A discovery that would land with devastating force once the full context of Diane's story was finally revealed. This pattern of technological mourning is difficult to weigh in isolation from the larger question this entire documentary is building toward, and it would be premature to weigh it here. What can be said, at this stage in the history, is that the ship's intelligence represents the first clear evidence that grief, not curiosity, was quietly functioning as one of the primary engines behind Rick Sanchez's scientific output, a pattern that the rest of this documentary will trace forward until it finally surfaces in full. An intelligence built from memory solved the problem of never being alone in the cockpit. But memory, once built into the architecture of daily life, has a way of resurfacing at the worst possible moment. Sometimes decades later, sometimes in a place designed specifically to keep it buried. For years, Morty Smith lived with a gap in his own mind that he did not know existed. Hidden within Rick's garage, behind ordinary shelving and unremarkable clutter, sat a bank of memory storage devices, each one a small, glowing container holding a discrete fragment of Morty's own past, removed from his conscious recollection and preserved in isolation. The technology responsible for this arrangement operated on a straightforward principle once explained, though its implications were considerably less straightforward. Rick had developed a method for surgically extracting specific memories from a living brain, storing them externally in stable containment, and leaving the rest of the mind to continue operating as though the extracted memory had never happened at all. The purpose behind this technology was, at least initially, protective in a narrow and self-serving sense. Many of the adventures Rick brought Morty along on ended in outcomes too traumatic, too strange, or too legally and emotionally complicated to leave intact in an adolescent's daily memory. Rather than deal with the psychological fallout of those experiences directly, Rick simply removed them, storing the raw memory in the garage the way another parent might store old report cards, technically preserved, functionally forgotten, and entirely out of sight from the person they most directly concerned. The full scope of this arrangement was uncovered almost by accident when Morty and Summer, exploring the garage during an ordinary evening while their parents were occupied elsewhere, discovered the storage units and began sampling them out of curiosity, each memory replaying as a vivid, immersive sequence the moment its container was activated. What followed was less a single revelation and more an accumulating series of them. One extracted memory after another, surfacing to reveal just how much of Morty's adolescence had been quietly edited out of his own conscious timeline, without his consent. Some of the recovered memories were darkly comic, minor embarrassments and small-scale disasters that Rick had judged not worth the psychological cost of remembering. Others were considerably heavier, including a memory in which Morty's carelessness inadvertently drove another person to end his own life. An event Rick had judged too damaging to leave in his grandson's active memory, and had simply removed rather than help him process. This last detail carries significant weight in the broader arc of this history, because it exposes something important about the underlying philosophy behind Rick's use of memory storage technology. He did not develop the capability primarily as a tool of malicious control, in the way some of his other inventions might reasonably be read. He developed it, at least in this instance, as a blunt instrument of emotional avoidance, both for Morty and, by extension, for himself. Rather than sit with his grandson through the aftermath of a genuinely traumatic event, rather than have the difficult conversation that trauma demands, Rick chose the technologically simpler path. Excise the memory,
store it in the garage, and allow both of them to continue functioning as though the difficulty had never occurred. It is a pattern immediately recognizable as an extension of the same instinct that built an artificial intelligence around the voice of a dead wife rather than confronting her loss directly. Faced with pain too large to process, Rick's engineering instinct was never to work through it. It was to build a container for it and set it aside. The scientific principle underlying the extraction process itself involves isolating the specific neural pattern associated with a given memory and transferring it into an external storage medium capable of maintaining that pattern's coherence indefinitely, a process considerably more delicate than simple deletion, since a memory removed carelessly can leave behind detectable gaps or unstable psychological residue. Rick's mastery of the technique was, by the standards of this civilization, exceptionally refined, allowing him to remove specific memories from Morty's mind so cleanly that Morty himself never noticed anything had been taken, a fact that, once discovered, troubled Morty considerably more than the content of any individual memory he uncovered. The realization that an entire portion of his own life had been curated without his knowledge or consent, silently, over a period of years, introduced a new and lasting form of unease into his relationship with his grandfather, one that would resurface repeatedly in the years that followed. What makes this technology particularly significant to the wider history is the moment, near the end of Morty and Summer's exploration of the storage units, when they encounter a memory neither of them had extracted. Buried among the collection sits a memory belonging not to any specific traumatic incident, but to something closer to an accumulated emotional truth, delivered in a single, unguarded moment that briefly cracks open the emotional architecture underlying the entire relationship between Rick and his grandson. It suggests that memory storage technology, however casually Rick deployed it for convenience, had also, without his intending it, become an unintentional archive of his own affection, preserved in the one form he seemed capable of expressing it, quietly, indirectly, and hidden somewhere he assumed no one would think to look. The characters affected by this technology extend well beyond Morty himself. Summer, present for the entire discovery, absorbed a version of the same unease her brother experienced, compounded by the realization that she too might have memories quietly filed away somewhere in that same garage without her knowledge. The trust required to function within a family that had access to technology capable of silently rewriting a person's remembered history proved, for both siblings, considerably harder to re-establish than the technology itself had been to build. How memory storage technology is judged depends heavily on which memory is being discussed. In cases of genuine trauma, the technology arguably spared Morty psychological damage he was, at the time, entirely unequipped to process on his own. In cases where the extracted memory concerned nothing more than convenience or embarrassment, the technology functioned as something closer to quiet erasure, a small but accumulating theft of a young person's right to his own remembered life. It stands as one of the clearest illustrations in this entire documentary of a recurring truth about Rick's engineering. The line between protecting someone and controlling them, in his hands, was rarely a line he seemed interested in locating. Removing pain from memory solved the problem of unbearable weight. But some weight, it would turn out, was never meant to be removed. It was meant to be carried by more than one person. Not every device that reshaped this civilization's trajectory was built by the mind most associated with this documentary. Some of the most consequential technologies in this history were simply taken, acquired through theft, negotiation, or outright violence. And few examples illustrate this more clearly than the time crystal Rick obtained during the single most elaborate escape plan of his imprisoned life. To understand why the crystal mattered, it helps to understand the circumstances that made it necessary. Following a period of voluntary surrender to galactic authorities, undertaken specifically to protect his family from a mounting series of threats his lifestyle had exposed them to, Rick found himself confined within a maximum security interdimensional prison, cut off from his usual tools, his usual resources, and his usual freedom to simply portal his way out of any inconvenience. An ordinary escape from a facility built specifically to contain beings of Rick's caliber would have required extraordinary planning even under the best circumstances. Rick did not settle for ordinary planning.
Instead, he arranged, through a lengthy and deliberately obscured chain of manipulation, to acquire a device known as a time crystal, originally created and guarded by a reclusive collector named Thaddeus Beauregard. The crystal's function, once understood, explains why it was worth the extraordinary effort required to obtain it. Looking into the crystal allowed its user to view every possible branching outcome that could result from a single choice made in the immediate future, each potential timeline playing out in rapid, navigable succession, allowing the user to identify, with total certainty, precisely which sequence of actions would lead to the exact result they wanted. This capability differs meaningfully from the interdimensional travel established earlier in this history. Portal technology allows movement between existing realities, each already fixed and populated with its own history. The time crystal, by contrast, allows a user to preview realities that have not yet happened, branching possibilities generated from a single present moment, collapsing the uncertainty of the future into something closer to a solved equation. For a mind like Rick's, built around the relentless pursuit of guaranteed outcomes, the device represented something close to an ultimate weapon, not of destruction, but of certainty. Using it, Rick was able to construct an escape plan of almost inconceivable intricacy, one that accounted for every guard, every failsafe, and every possible variable standing between his prison cell and his family's freedom. Selecting from among countless simulated futures the singular sequence of events that guaranteed success. The plan that resulted, once executed, dismantled far more than a single prison cell. Rick's escape triggered a cascading collapse of the galactic authority that had imprisoned him, an organization that had, in the years prior, established significant control over Earth itself, regulating its economy, its currency, and much of its daily infrastructure under the framework of interdimensional oversight. When that authority's grip on Earth collapsed as a direct consequence of Rick's escape, the planet's economy, which had become quietly dependent on the occupying structure's technology and currency, collapsed along with it. What should have been, by any narrow measure, an unambiguous liberation instead produced widespread economic devastation across the very world Rick had ostensibly surrendered himself to protect. This outcome deserves particular attention because it represents one of the clearest instances in this entire history of an invention succeeding completely on its own terms while failing catastrophically on every term that mattered to the people around it. The time crystal did exactly what it was designed to do. It delivered a guaranteed outcome, calculated with total precision, and Rick achieved exactly the escape he had planned for. What the crystal could not account for, because it was never asked to account for it, was the well-being of an entire planet's population once the structure occupying it was suddenly and completely removed. Certainty about a single desired outcome, this episode of Rick's history demonstrates with unusual clarity, is not the same thing as wisdom about the full consequences of achieving it. The characters who benefited most directly from this sequence of events were, in the most immediate sense, Rick's own family, reunited after a prolonged separation and freed, at least in theory, from the specific threats that had prompted Rick's surrender in the first place. Jerry, in particular, experienced a strange and complicated form of vindication during this period, having spent Rick's imprisonment attempting, with limited success, to hold the family together on his own terms for the first time in years. Beth's relationship to her father deepened during this period as well, colored by a gratitude that would later prove difficult to reconcile with everything else she would eventually learn about him. The characters who suffered, by contrast, were considerably less visible in the story, but no less real within it. The ordinary residents of Earth, left to absorb the economic shock of an occupying power's sudden departure, a consequence the documentary record of this period tends to treat as background noise rather than the direct casualty of Rick's certainty-driven engineering that it actually was. The time crystal resists a simple verdict of help or harm, in large part because its use was so narrowly targeted at a single outcome that its broader effects were never meaningfully accounted for by the person wielding it. It freed Rick. It reunited a family. It also destabilized an entire planet's economic infrastructure as an incidental side effect of a plan designed exclusively around one man's certainty of success. This asymmetry, a personal problem solved with total precision alongside a civilizational problem created with total indifference, would recur throughout the remainder of Rick's engineering history. each instance slightly larger in scale than the one before it. Certainty solved the problem of escape, but certainty about one outcome is never the same as responsibility for every outcome it displaces.
That distinction would not become fully visible until an entire government, built specifically to contain minds like Rick's, began the slow work of understanding exactly what it had let loose. To understand the true scale of what the Citadel had become by the time its full infrastructure was finally documented, it helps to return to the institution itself, years after its initial construction, once its population, economy, and internal contradictions had all matured into something approaching a genuine civilization. What had begun as a loose coalition of Ricks seeking mutual protection had, by this later period, developed into a sprawling metropolis with its own manufacturing plants, its own currency, its own police academy, and its own judiciary. An entire infrastructure built to sustain billions of duplicated citizens who, on the whole, understood themselves to be individuals despite sharing a genetic and psychological template with nearly everyone around them. The manufacturing side of this infrastructure deserves particular attention because it reveals the extent to which the Citadel's economy depended on the continuous, industrial-scale production of Mortys. Facilities existed specifically to generate new Morty citizens on demand, feeding both the ordinary demand of Ricks requiring companions and a wider economy of labor that had grown up around the constant need for disposable, replaceable workers. This manufacturing base extended into darker corners of the Citadel's economy as well, including underground operations that used freshly produced Morty bodies for purposes far removed from companionship, a black market that existing law enforcement was, at best, only partially interested in stopping. The Citadel's own police force, staffed largely by Ricks who had failed to secure more prestigious positions elsewhere in its hierarchy, patrolled a society whose entire economic foundation rested on the presumption that a Morty's life carried less inherent value than a Rick's, a presumption baked so deeply into the Citadel's founding structure that even its own justice system rarely questioned it directly. It was within this environment that a quieter, more consequential development began to take shape. The emergence of organized Morty citizenship, complete with electoral politics and, eventually, an aspirant candidate for the Citadel's highest office. A campaign built around a Morty seeking the presidency represented something the Citadel's founders had almost certainly never anticipated when they first organized their coalition. The entire structure of the institution depended on Mortys remaining psychologically and politically subordinate, present in sufficient numbers to serve their assigned Ricks without ever accumulating enough collective power to challenge the arrangement itself. A Morty campaigning for president was not simply an electoral event. It was the first visible crack in the foundational assumption the entire Citadel had been built on. The campaign succeeded, and a Morty was elected to the Citadel's presidency, a moment that historians of this civilization would later recognize as considerably more significant than it appeared at the time. Behind the public campaign, however, sat a much darker private history, one that would not be fully understood until years later. The Morty who assumed office was not, as most citizens of the Citadel believed, simply an ambitious political outsider who had risen through legitimate means. He was the same Morty who, years earlier, had first appeared as an unsettling counterpart to Rick's own grandson, a Morty whose relationship to his own Rick had ended in violence, and whose subsequent path through the Citadel's institutions had been guided less by public service and more by a long, patient, deeply calculated plan to gain access to the one resource he actually wanted: information locked inside the mind of a specific Rick, obtained through prolonged, invasive psychic scanning that had begun years before his presidential campaign ever started. This detail transforms the entire episode from a story about institutional reform into something closer to a long con executed against an entire civilization. The presidency was never the goal. It was a means of legitimizing access, a position of sufficient authority that the deeper project quietly running underneath it, an extended effort to extract complete architectural knowledge of the Citadel's own dimensional infrastructure directly from the mind of the Rick who had originally helped design it, could proceed without interruption or suspicion. Understanding this retroactively recontextualizes the entire period of Citadel history covered in this section. The institution's first Morty president was not a triumph of representative government over an exploitative caste system. He was patient zero for a plan that would not fully detonate for years, and whose consequences would eventually bring the entire structure of the Central Finite Curve to its knees. The scientific infrastructure underlying all of this, the manufacturing plants, the currency systems, the interdimensional courts, existed to sustain a society that had, in a very real sense, been built to be exploited from the inside by someone who understood its internal machinery better than anyone else alive. This is, in retrospect, one of the more unsettling ironies contained anywhere in this documentary. A civilization organized entirely around the premise that Ricks were inherently superior to Mortys proved, in the end, vulnerable to exactly the kind of long-term, patient, meticulously executed plan that the Citadel's own culture had always assumed only a Rick could conceive of and carry out. The characters affected by this period of Citadel history are almost too numerous to summarize individually, given the scale of the population involved, but a few deserve specific mention. Ordinary Morty citizens, many of whom had built genuine lives within the Citadel's flawed but functioning institutions, found themselves governed, unknowingly, by a leader whose true agenda had nothing to do with their welfare. The specific Rick, whose mind had been the actual target of the entire campaign, spent years unaware that a scan initiated against him during an earlier, seemingly unrelated encounter had never actually stopped, continuing patiently in the background of his life while he went about believing the danger had long since passed. This period of Citadel history cannot be judged in isolation, because its true consequences would not become visible until much later, once the information gathered during this presidency was finally put to use. What can be said with confidence is that the Citadel, for all its manufacturing capacity, its legal infrastructure, and its billions of citizens, had built a civilization so thoroughly organized around the assumption of Rick's inherent superiority that it never seriously considered the possibility that its greatest existential threat might come from the very underclass it had spent decades manufacturing to serve it. A Morty presidency solved, on its surface, the problem of representation. Underneath it, a much older and more patient scheme was solving a different problem entirely, the problem of how to finally get out. While the Citadel's long game continued to unfold patiently in the background of this civilization's history, a much smaller and more private piece of technology was quietly waiting to be rediscovered on Earth, buried not in political ambition, but in a father's decades-old attempt to manage a problem he had never known how to address directly. That technology was Fruppyland, a fully realized pocket dimension Rick had constructed years earlier, and its rediscovery would force open one of the most personally revealing chapters in this entire documented history. The circumstances surrounding Fruppyland's creation only became clear once Beth, prompted by news of a childhood friend's father facing execution for a decades-old murder, began to recall memories of a magical fantasy world she had believed for most of her adult life to be nothing more than an elaborate, imaginative game from her childhood. Rick's eventual, characteristically blunt explanation revealed a far stranger truth. Fruppyland had never been imaginary. It was a real, procedurally generated, fully child-proofed pocket universe, collapsed into existence out of what Rick described as a quantum tesseract, built specifically to contain and entertain a young Beth whose childhood requests, ranging from functioning ray guns to weaponized accessories, had convinced her father that she needed somewhere safer than the ordinary world to spend her unsupervised time. The scientific principle behind Fruppyland extends the same underlying logic established earlier by the microverse battery, but repurposed toward an entirely different end. Rather than generate a universe to extract labor or energy from its inhabitants, Rick generated a universe designed to generate content. Endless, self-renewing, candy-colored terrain and creatures, engineered to occupy a child's imagination indefinitely while requiring no ongoing supervision from the adult who had built it. Fruppyland functioned, in effect, as an extraordinarily advanced form of childcare, a pocket reality built less out of love in the conventional sense and more out of Rick's characteristic instinct to solve an inconvenient problem. in this case parenting, through engineering rather than presence. The consequences of this solution proved far darker than Rick had ever anticipated. Beth's childhood friend Tommy became trapped within Fruppyland during a visit as a child. And rather than the innocent adventure Beth remembered, his actual survival within the pocket dimension over the following years involved a slow, horrifying descent into using the dimension's artificial life forms, themselves corrupted with fragments of human genetic material. First as a means of physical survival, and eventually as subjects of his own increasingly disturbing rule over the small society he came to dominate within Fruppyland's boundaries. When Rick and Beth finally re-entered the dimension as adults to search for him, what they found bore almost no resemblance to the wholesome, imaginative refuge Beth remembered, and the encounter forced both of them to confront uncomfortable truths about what had actually happened during Beth's childhood, and about who bore responsibility for it. It was during this same confrontation that clone technology, previously only alluded to elsewhere in this history, was demonstrated directly and consequentially for the first time. Faced with the practical impossibility of returning Tommy's true fate to his father in any form that could resolve the pending execution, Rick and Beth instead constructed a clone of Tommy from a preserved biological sample, a fully functioning genetic duplicate designed to convincingly replace the man whose actual fate had been rendered too disturbing to disclose. The clone was accepted without suspicion, and the execution was called off, technically resolving the immediate crisis, while quietly replacing an entire human being with a manufactured substitute that no one outside Rick and Beth would ever know was not the original. This use of clone technology mattered enormously to the wider arc of this history, not because it was the first appearance of duplication technology within Rick's arsenal, but because of what it revealed about the ease and casualness with which cloning could be deployed to resolve deeply uncomfortable truths without ever requiring anyone to sit with those truths directly. A man's actual, horrifying fate was quietly replaced with a convenient fiction, and the fiction proved entirely sufficient to satisfy everyone who had ever known him. It is worth noting how directly this pattern echoes the earlier use of memory storage technology to remove Morty's traumatic experiences rather than help him process them. Confronted with something too painful to explain, Rick's engineering instinct was, once again, not to help the people around him work through the difficulty. It was to manufacture a replacement convincing enough that the difficulty could be quietly set aside. The most significant consequence of this entire sequence, however, was not Tommy's fate, but the conversation it produced between Rick and Beth once they returned home. Confronted directly with the reality that he had built Fruppyland less out of affection and more out of a desire to be relieved of the burden of raising her, Rick, uncharacteristically, did not deny it. He confirmed it. He acknowledged plainly that he had been an inadequate father, and in the same breath offered Beth something that reframed the entire episode's underlying themes with startling clarity. The option to have a clone of herself created, indistinguishable from the original, that could remain behind to raise her own children, while the true Beth was finally freed to pursue the unrestricted, adventurous life she had always secretly wanted but never had the chance to live. Beth's answer to this offer was left deliberately unresolved in the moment, a silence that would linger, unexplained, until a much later chapter in this documentary finally addressed it directly. What matters here is the offer itself, and what it reveals about clone technology's deepest and most unsettling application within this civilization. It was never simply a tool for resurrection or convenience. In its most significant use, it became a mechanism for a person to escape their own life without technically abandoning it, splitting a single identity into two functioning versions so that neither the responsibilities nor the desires of that identity would have to be sacrificed in favor of the other. The characters affected most deeply by this chapter were, unmistakably, Beth and Rick themselves, whose relationship was reshaped permanently by a conversation neither of them had ever had the vocabulary to initiate before Fruppyland forced it into the open. Tommy's father, spared an unjust execution through means he would never understand, represents a quieter, more distant casualty of the same event.
a man whose relief was built entirely on a substitution he never consented to and could never have imagined. Fruppyland and the clone technology it introduced are difficult to judge on a single ledger, because the full weight of the consequences would not arrive until years later, once the offer made in this chapter was finally and consequentially acted upon. A pocket universe solved the problem of an unsupervised childhood. Clone technology solved the much larger problem of an unlivable choice between duty and freedom. Neither solution, it would turn out, was ever as clean as it first appeared. The question left hanging at the end of Fruppyland's rediscovery, whether Beth would accept her father's offer to be cloned so that she could finally live an unrestricted life, did not remain unanswered for long, though the answer arrived in a form that reframed the entire premise of the offer itself. Rather than resolving the dilemma through a single clean decision, Beth appears to have accepted the offer entirely, resulting not in one version of herself replacing another, but in two fully independent, fully autonomous Beths, one remaining on Earth to raise Summer and Morty in the household the family had always known, and the other departing to lead a life of galactic adventure under the identity that would come to be known across this civilization simply as Space Beth. This development introduces one of the more philosophically complicated pieces of technology covered anywhere in this documentary, because unlike most of Rick's cloning work, this instance was never designed to conceal a substitution. It was designed to eliminate the need to choose at all. Clone technology, applied here, did not produce an original and a copy in any meaningful hierarchical sense. It produced two Beths, each possessing the full, unbroken continuity of memory and personality up until the moment of duplication, each equally convinced of her own authenticity, and crucially, neither one initially aware that the other existed. For years, both Beths lived out their separate lives without knowledge of the arrangement Rick had quietly engineered on their behalf. An arrangement that, once again, solved an emotionally impossible dilemma through pure engineering, rather than through the far harder work of confronting it honestly with the person it most affected. The reunion of the two Beths, once it finally occurred, produced one of the more unusual family confrontations in the history of this civilization, precisely because there was no straightforward way to determine which Beth, if either, could be considered the original. Both possessed identical childhood memories up until the point of divergence. Both had built entire, independent adult lives on the strength of those shared memories. The question of authenticity, which had seemed so urgent to both Beths in the moment of discovery, turned out, in the end, to be the wrong question entirely. One that this civilization's own cloning technology had rendered functionally meaningless the instant it created two equally continuous, equally lived experiences from a single point of origin. This is where the broader concept of decoy families becomes relevant to the wider arc of this history, and it extends considerably beyond the specific case of the two Beths. Across the many dimensions this documentary has already covered, the practice of using cloned or substituted family members to manage impossible situations recurs with striking regularity. From the clone constructed to replace Tommy Lipnip in front of his grieving father, to the broader, uncomfortable understanding that any sufficiently advanced Rick possesses the theoretical capacity to replace any member of his own family with a convincing substitute whenever the original becomes inconvenient, endangered, or simply unavailable. The existence of Space Beth confirms, more explicitly than any prior chapter in this history, that this capability was never purely theoretical. It had already been used, deliberately, on Rick's own daughter, with her own eventual consent, to resolve a lifelong tension between duty and freedom that no other technology in this civilization had ever managed to reconcile. The unexpected consequence of this arrangement extended well beyond the personal reconciliation between the two Beths themselves. Space Beth's independent existence drew the attention of a reorganized galactic authority, one that had reason to be interested in a duplicated, unregistered citizen operating outside its jurisdiction, and her presence introduced new complications into the family's relationship with the wider political structures of the multiverse that this documentary has already traced through the Citadel and its aftermath. Earthbeth, meanwhile, was left to reckon with a quieter and in some ways more difficult consequence.
The knowledge that an entire alternate version of her own life had been running in parallel for years, filled with exactly the kind of adventure and independence she had always privately wanted, while she herself had continued raising a family under the assumption that such a life had never been available to her at all. The characters most profoundly affected by this technology were, unavoidably, the two Beths themselves, whose relationship with one another and with the rest of the family required years of ongoing negotiation that this documentary's later chapters would continue to reference. Jerry, whose marriage had already survived considerable strain by this point in the family's history, found himself in the genuinely unprecedented position of maintaining a relationship with two independently existing versions of his wife, a situation that tested, and in time reshaped, the entire structure of the Smith household's domestic arrangements going forward. Summer and Morty, for their part, absorbed the revelation with a kind of weary familiarity that, by this stage in their lives, had become almost characteristic of how the family processed extraordinary disruption. Growing up in a household connected to unlimited interdimensional possibility had, by this point, considerably raised their threshold for what counted as a genuinely surprising development. The creation of Space Beth and the wider practice of decoy families resist a single verdict, because the arrangement succeeded in ways few of Rick's other emotionally motivated inventions ever managed to. Both Beths, by most available accounts, found something genuine and sustaining in the lives they were each finally able to live. An outcome considerably more humane than the quiet substitutions and unconsented replacements that characterized so much of this civilization's earlier cloning history. It stands as one of the few technologies in this documentary that, however strange its origins, ended up expanding rather than diminishing the autonomy of the person it was built around. Decoy technology solved the impossible problem of choosing between two irreconcilable lives. It did so by refusing to make either life a decoy at all. But not every use of this civilization's duplication technology would prove so generous to the people it was built to serve. Long before Rick ever needed a contingency plan against his own mortality, a smaller and more personal experiment had already tested how well a duplicated version of himself could survive contact with his own family. That earlier experiment, conducted quietly and kept largely hidden from Beth, Summer, and Morty, involved transferring Rick's consciousness into a cloned body, younger, more energetic, and initially indistinguishable in personality from the original. The clone, nicknamed Tiny Rick by the grandchildren who briefly enjoyed his company, proved charming, capable, and genuinely useful, right up until the underlying flaw in the process revealed itself. The younger clone body did not merely house Rick's mind. It began, gradually and then decisively, to reshape that mind around its own youthful impulses, eroding the judgment and self-restraint that made the original Rick recognizable as himself. Confronted with a growing bank of additional clones in varying stages of development, stored in an underground chamber beneath the family's own home, Rick made the decision to destroy the entire experiment himself, judging it, in his own words, an outright failure. What none of his family understood at the time was that the failure had not actually ended the project. It had only driven it underground, quite literally, into a backup system that continued running in secret for years afterward. This system, later understood under the formal designation of Operation Phoenix, was designed to solve the single problem that no amount of certainty or foresight could ever fully eliminate from Rick's life: death itself. Under the system's true operating principle, revealed only much later, any death Rick suffered, in any dimension, would automatically trigger the transfer of his consciousness into a freshly grown clone body waiting in a corresponding vat elsewhere in the multiverse, allowing him to continue existing across an unbroken chain of bodies, regardless of how many individual versions of himself were destroyed along the way. The unsettling scope of this technology became fully apparent only after Rick died, unexpectedly, in an entirely unrelated incident involving a piece of related technology known as a death crystal, a device closely related in principle to the time crystal covered earlier in this history, though narrower in its function. Where the time crystal revealed every branching outcome of a chosen action, a death crystal revealed, specifically, every possible manner in which its user might eventually die,
presented as a rapid, navigable sequence of potential futures. Rick used death crystals habitually, as a kind of ongoing insurance policy, scanning ahead for dangerous outcomes and quietly avoiding them before they could occur. Morty, given access to a death crystal of his own during this period, used it for a very different purpose, attempting to engineer a future in which he died peacefully, decades from now, beside Jessica, the classmate he had been infatuated with for years. In his single-minded pursuit of that one specific outcome, Morty inadvertently caused the car accident that killed Rick outright. What followed exposed Operation Phoenix's true and considerably darker mechanics. Rick's consciousness, rather than simply ending, began cycling automatically through clone bodies in dimension after dimension, each transfer landing him, with grim consistency, inside a fascist alternate reality. One Rick after another, waking briefly into a nightmare version of his own civilization, before dying again and triggering the next transfer. This pattern suggested something uncomfortable about the wider multiverse itself, that a disproportionate number of Ricks, faced with the same ethical reckoning that had led the original to destroy his own clone experiment, had instead abandoned the safeguard halfway through, leaving behind unstable, damaged backup systems scattered across dimensions that had since fallen to authoritarian rule. It was only after several failed cycles that Rick's consciousness finally landed inside a stable, functioning clone body belonging to a version of himself who had never abandoned his family, in a dimension where an alternate Rick, transformed years earlier into an insectoid form and known locally as Wasp Rick, helped guide the stranded consciousness back home. The unexpected consequences of this entire sequence extended well past Rick's own survival. Morty, who had spent the episode blindly following the Death Crystal's guidance toward his one desired outcome, found himself manipulated into increasingly disturbing behavior along the way, including a killing spree carried out under the crystal's influence before he was finally extracted from its control. The broader implication, once the smoke cleared, was that certainty technology of this kind, whether in the form of a time crystal or its narrower descendant, the death crystal, carried the same fundamental danger regardless of who wielded it. A single desired outcome, pursued with total confidence and without regard for anything outside that outcome, will reliably corrode the judgment of whoever is chasing it. A lesson this civilization had already learned once, at planetary scale, during the collapse of Earth's economy following Rick's prison escape, and was now learning again at the scale of a single adolescent's infatuation. Operation Phoenix itself would resurface years later under circumstances considerably more dangerous than a single family's private crisis. During the eventual breach of the Central Finite Curve, a chapter covered later in this documentary, the same clone revival infrastructure that had once quietly saved Rick's life was deliberately sabotaged and repurposed as a weapon, its vats converted into a mechanism for destroying rather than preserving the Ricks and Mortys who relied on it. A safeguard originally built out of one man's fear of his own mortality would, in the end, be turned, by someone who understood its architecture intimately, into an instrument of mass execution. A separate but related piece of infrastructure from this same general period deserves brief mention here as well: the neutrino-based ordnance that a younger Morty once helped disarm during an ill-fated team mission alongside a group of self-styled interdimensional heroes known as the Vindicators. The device, planted as part of a wider act of sabotage within the team, represented an early and comparatively minor example of the kind of planetary-scale weaponry this civilization had already learned to build, and, just as often, learned to weaponize against itself from within. Its successful disarmament by Morty, achieved under pressure and without Rick's direct assistance, marked one of the first moments in this documented history where Morty demonstrated genuine competence entirely independent of his grandfather's guidance, a small but meaningful data point in the slow, uneven development of his own capabilities. The characters most affected by this entire chapter were, once again, Rick and Morty themselves, whose relationship absorbed a new and lasting strain once the full scope of Operation Phoenix's secrecy became apparent. Rick had, for years, maintained a private, unspoken safeguard against his own death, one his family had no knowledge of and no say in, while simultaneously lecturing them about honesty and self-reliance. How this technology is judged depends entirely on which version of it is being discussed. As a private contingency, it preserved a father and grandfather's presence in his family's life across several near-fatal incidents. As an exploitable piece of shared infrastructure, it would later prove capable of becoming exactly the kind of instrument its original destruction had been meant to prevent. Immortality solved the problem of death. It did not solve the much older problem of what a mind does with the certainty that it cannot truly be lost. That problem, as the next chapter of this history reveals, was never Rick's to solve alone. Everything this documentary has traced so far, the portal gun, the Citadel, the manufactured Mortys, the quiet presidency built on a decade of patient deception, converges in a single event that historians of this civilization now regard as the true turning point of the entire era, the breach of the Central Finite Curve. To understand why this event carries the weight it does, it helps to return, briefly, to the Morty who had spent years working his way into the Citadel's highest office, because the plan that finally detonated during this period had, by that point, been in motion for the better part of a decade. The scan this Morty had initiated years earlier, during an encounter with the Rick who would eventually raise the family at the center of this documentary, had never actually stopped. It had continued patiently in the background of an ordinary, unremarkable life, gathering piece by piece the complete architectural knowledge needed to understand how the Citadel's dimensional infrastructure, and by extension the boundary of the Central Finite Curve itself, had originally been constructed. Once that scan finally reached completion, the presidency that had provided such effective cover for the entire operation was no longer necessary, and the true purpose behind years of careful political maneuvering was revealed all at once over the course of a single, devastating evening. Having gained access to the schematics for the Citadel's dimensional drive, this Morty explained, calmly and at length, what the Central Finite Curve had actually been all along. It was not, as generations of Ricks and Mortys had assumed, simply the natural limit of accessible reality. It was a deliberately curated boundary, engineered specifically so that within its borders, a version of Rick would always be among the most intelligent beings present, and so that a version of Morty would always exist alongside him, bred for that exact purpose across the Citadel's manufacturing infrastructure. The entire civilizational project this documentary has traced from its earliest days, the coalition of Ricks who built a shared home for mutual protection, had, from its inception, been an elaborate cage, constructed by Ricks for the psychological comfort of Ricks, populated by an entire species of beings engineered to remain trapped inside it alongside them. Before departing this portion of the multiverse entirely, this Morty ensured that his exit would cause maximum damage to the institution that had produced him. He sabotaged the Citadel's portal fluid supply, contaminating it so that any portal opened using the tainted reserves would lead not to a chosen destination, but to a hostile dimension populated by a creature capable of killing instantly. He similarly compromised Operation Phoenix, the very clone revival infrastructure this documentary examined in its previous chapter, rerouting its emergency VATS so that any Rick or Morty attempting to use the system as an escape route would instead be destroyed, their remains repurposed as raw fuel to power the very dimensional drive being used against them. Those who tried to flee through conventional portals died instantly. Those who tried to use the Phoenix system as a fallback were liquefied and burned as fuel. Those who did neither were caught in the resulting devastation regardless. It was, in the most literal sense available to this documentary, a purge, executed against an entire civilization by the one person that civilization's own foundational architecture had never accounted for. A Morty who understood the system too completely to remain contained by it. Having gathered the schematics necessary to force open a passage through the curve itself, this Morty then executed the final phase of his plan, using a specially constructed device that drew on both Rick and Morty genetic material, combined with portal fluid, to blast directly through the boundary that had confined the entire civilization for as long as anyone could remember. The resulting breach consumed a significant portion of the Citadel outright, collapsing it in a singularity that swallowed the very structure meant to have been indestructible, while its architect escaped through the newly opened seam using a personal shuttle, arriving in a region of the wider multiverse that Rick's, by design, had never been able to reach. What Morty carried with him through that breach was a portal gun, unlike any other device examined in this documentary. Where every gun built by every Rick across the Central Finite Curve produced the same green-tinted portal, a signature so consistent it had become, without anyone fully realizing it, a kind of dimensional fingerprint of the curve's own boundaries. This Morty's gun produced portals of a different color entirely, a pale, unmistakable yellow. The distinction was never explained directly, but its implication reshaped the understanding of everything this documentary had covered up to this point. A yellow portal suggested access to dimensions the green portals had never been capable of reaching, universes existing entirely outside the curated slice of reality every prior chapter of this history had unknowingly confined itself to. It raised, for the first time, an uncomfortable structural question that would linger unanswered for years. If the Central Finite Curve had been built by Ricks, using green portal technology that could never leave its own boundary, then whatever had first drawn that boundary's outer wall might never have been Rick's creation at all. The consequences of this breach rippled outward across every layer of the civilization this documentary has traced so far. The Citadel, the largest and most consequential piece of infrastructure this history had examined, was gone, its billions of citizens scattered, killed, or left to rebuild whatever remained of its wreckage. Rick's own portal gun, damaged in the fighting, was left inoperable, stranding him and his family without reliable access to the very technology that had defined the shape of their lives since this documentary's opening chapter. And Morty, the grandson who had spent years accompanying Rick across the multiverse without fully understanding the architecture governing where they were and were not able to go, was finally shown the outline of the cage his entire life had been quietly organized around. The character who suffered most immediately and most visibly from this event was Rick himself, forced to watch an institution he had helped build and a boundary he may have helped originally establish, dismantled by the one category of being that boundary had been specifically constructed to keep subordinate. The character who benefited, at least in the narrow sense of achieving exactly what he had set out to achieve, was the Morty who orchestrated the entire breach, though the freedom he won came at the cost of an isolation this documentary would later trace to its own bitter conclusion. How the breach is judged depends on the scale at which the question is asked. It ended, decisively and permanently, the specific system of exploitation this documentary has traced since its earliest chapters. It also unleashed a level of chaos, violence, and unresolved structural uncertainty that the remainder of this civilization's history would spend years attempting to absorb. The Central Finite Curve had solved the problem of a Rick's psychological need to always be the smartest being in the room. Breaking it solved the problem of an entire species bred to serve that need. But breaking a cage does not automatically free the person who built it from the reasons he built it in the first place. In the aftermath of the Curve's breach, Rick's broken portal gun became something closer to a symbol than a malfunction. He had the ability, by every account, to repair it relatively quickly, and yet the repair remained perpetually unfinished, month after month, an open project Rick would reference whenever the subject arose and then quietly set aside again. He described the delay, when pressed, as simply his process, an explanation that satisfied no one in his household, but which no one was quite able to argue him out of either. During this period, the family's access to interdimensional travel narrowed considerably, and even a routine task like driving Morty to school became, on at least one occasion, a genuine hazard, when an unstable rift left behind by the Curve's breach summoned a hostile creature directly into the family garage. It was into this period of stalled repair and quiet denial that a new and unexpected variable arrived, in the form of an entire civilization few in this history had ever expected to encounter again. Dinosaurs, long assumed extinct on Earth and on every comparable world across the dimensions this documentary has covered,
revealed themselves to be very much alive, having left their homeworlds behind millions of years earlier and gone on, in the intervening time, to build a civilization of genuine, almost unsettling sophistication. Where humanity had spent its own comparatively brief history locked in cycles of conflict and short-term self-interest, the dinosaurs who returned to Earth during this period presented themselves as having transcended nearly all of it, arriving not as conquerors, but as something closer to benevolent emissaries, offering to solve problems that generations of human institutions had never managed to resolve on their own.
What made this encounter so consequential to the wider arc of this documentary was not the dinosaurs' return itself, but the specific technology they brought with them. Their civilization had independently developed its own version of interdimensional portal travel, a discovery this documentary has already established was never unique to any single lineage of Ricks. And their version of the technology was, by every meaningful measure, more advanced than Rick's. Where Rick's portals had always taken the form of an opaque, swirling slime-green tear, the dinosaurs' portal pistols generated a portal a user could see through before ever stepping inside it, allowing a traveler to preview a destination with a clarity Rick's own decades-old formula had never approached. The dinosaurs offered Rick one of their own devices as a gift, a gesture that, given everything the rest of this history reveals about Rick's relationship to his own sense of superiority, could not have been better calibrated to wound him if it had been designed for that exact purpose. The scientific principle behind the dinosaurs' portal pistol appears to build on the same fundamental discovery underlying Rick's own technology, the destabilization of the boundary between adjacent folds of space-time, but refined with a transparency mechanism that allowed the destination to be partially observed before the traveler committed to crossing. This single design improvement carried an outsized symbolic weight within the wider history of interdimensional travel this documentary has traced, because it represented the first instance of another civilization not merely matching Rick's foundational discovery, but meaningfully improving on it in a way immediately visible to anyone using the device. For a mind whose entire identity had been organized since this documentary's opening chapters around being the smartest being in whatever room he occupied, watching a species he considered beneath serious regard hand him a strictly better version of his own defining invention proved to be an injury no amount of dismissiveness could fully disguise. Rick's response to this injury followed a pattern this documentary has already observed in smaller forms throughout his history. Rather than accept the gift, study it, or incorporate its improvements into his own work, he destroyed the offered portal pistol outright and set out to discredit the civilization that had given it to him, traveling with Morty to the wreckage of every world the dinosaurs had previously visited, searching for evidence of some past failure or hypocrisy that might restore the sense of relative superiority their gift had quietly punctured. What he found instead, on world after world, was the same grim pattern repeating itself. Every planet the dinosaurs had ever settled had eventually been struck by a catastrophic meteor impact, an unrelated and apparently unavoidable cosmic threat that had nothing to do with the dinosaurs' own conduct and everything to do with the sheer scale of dangers that exist independently of any civilization's choices. The search for evidence of dinosaur hypocrisy produced, instead, an accidental reminder that intelligence, however advanced, does not grant immunity from the universe's more indifferent forms of destruction. The unresolved tension of this entire encounter was settled, in the end, less by reconciliation than by circumstance. Faced with the return of the same meteor threat that had wiped out every prior dinosaur settlement, and unwilling to simply let an advanced civilization be destroyed purely to satisfy his own wounded pride, Rick's stubborn insistence on proving himself superior eventually produced, almost as an afterthought, the very breakthrough his broken portal gun had needed all along. The dinosaurs departed for a new, undisclosed destination shortly afterward. Their brief return to Earth concluded, and Rick, through a combination of accumulated frustration and inadvertent inspiration, finally repaired the technology this documentary's earlier chapters had established as the very foundation of his entire scientific legacy. The characters affected by this episode extend beyond Rick himself. Morty, who had spent the preceding months navigating a household destabilized by his grandfather's stalled repairs, absorbed yet another lesson about the specific, narrow vanity that could derail even Rick's most practical decisions.
The dinosaurs, for their part, departed largely unaffected by the encounter, their own civilization secure enough, by this point in its development, to withstand the ego of a single scientist from a considerably younger and less advanced species without much lasting concern. In the scale of this documentary's larger concerns, this episode is a relatively contained one to judge. It restored Rick's access to interdimensional travel, the technology this entire history has been built around, and it did so, fittingly, only after forcing him to sit with the uncomfortable reality that his own foundational discovery was neither unique nor, by that point, particularly advanced. The portal gun that reopened the multiverse to Rick's family was not, in the end, an act of pure genius reasserting itself. It was the reluctant byproduct of a wounded ego finally getting out of its own way. A rival civilization's superior technology solved the problem of Rick's stalled repair, but it left behind a quieter, more personal problem that no repaired portal gun could fix. The question of who Rick actually was, once he could no longer claim to be the only one who had figured any of this out first. Every invention traced so far in this documentary has existed in the shadow of a question this history has repeatedly gestured toward without ever fully answering. Why did the Rick at the center of this story leave behind the life he had before? And what, exactly, happened to the family he had before Beth, Summer, Morty, and Jerry? For years, this question was treated within the civilization's own historical record as a private matter, referenced only obliquely, in fragments too painful for even Rick himself to discuss directly. It would take the better part of a decade, by the reckoning of the family this documentary has followed, before the full truth was finally allowed to surface. And when it did, it reorganized the meaning of nearly every invention examined in the preceding chapters. The truth, once assembled, was this. Rick had once been married to a woman named Diane, and together they had raised a young daughter. Another Rick, one who would come to be known simply as Rick Prime, had approached this earlier version of the family with an offer. An alliance built around the same discovery of interdimensional travel this documentary opened with, extended to a version of Rick who had made that same discovery independently and around the same time. When this earlier Rick declined the offer, choosing instead to remain settled with his family rather than join Rick Prime's wider ambitions across the multiverse, the refusal was answered with a violence that would come to define the remainder of this documentary's entire timeline. Rick Prime murdered Diane and the daughter she and Rick had raised together. An act carried out, by every indication this civilization's historical record has since gathered, less out of any coherent strategic purpose, and more out of simple, unrestrained spite at having been turned down. What followed consumed the better part of Rick's remaining life, though for years the rest of his family had no meaningful understanding of the scope of it. He devoted decades to hunting the Rick responsible, working under the mistaken belief, for a significant portion of that search, that any number of the Ricks he tracked down and killed across the multiverse might be the one he was actually looking for. It was this extended, largely misdirected campaign of vengeance that led, indirectly, to the founding of the Citadel this documentary examined earlier. An institution Rick helped organize, not out of any genuine belief in collective protection, but as a byproduct of an investigation that required exactly the kind of coordinated access to other Ricks that a shared institution could provide. The precise circumstances under which this earlier Rick eventually came to settle into the household this documentary has followed throughout, becoming the grandfather Morty and Summer grew up with, and the father Beth grew up believing she had always had, remain among the most carefully guarded ambiguities in this civilization's recorded history. Referenced only in passing, even by the people who lived through it, and this documentary will not attempt to resolve what the historical record itself has left deliberately unresolved. The identity of Rick Prime himself, once finally confirmed, revealed a figure whose relationship to intelligence and violence exceeded even Rick's own. Where the Rick this documentary has followed built an entire career out of solving problems, however recklessly, in service of some underlying attachment, however buried, to the people around him, Rick Prime appeared to operate from something closer to pure calculation, entirely unmoored from sentiment, except in the rare, unsettling instances where something briefly, genuinely moved him. His own account of the entire feud, delivered directly during the eventual confrontation this documentary now turns to, framed the difference between himself and his rival as nothing more than a matter of sequence. He had discovered portal travel first. Had the order been reversed, he suggested, the Rick who built this documentary's family might well have become him. The weapon Rick Prime had spent years perfecting, and which finally gave this entire hunt its name in the historical record, was a device that would come to be known as the Omega device. Its function, once demonstrated, revealed a capability unlike anything else examined anywhere in this documentary. Rather than harming a single individual in a single dimension, the Omega device was engineered to erase every version of a targeted person across the full accessible breadth of the multiverse simultaneously. A single, coordinated act of deletion executed against every branching timeline in which that person existed. Rick Prime had already used an early version of the device once before, years earlier, to erase every surviving version of Diane, a detail that meant the woman this documentary's earlier chapters described as lost to a single act of violence had, in fact, been erased far more completely and far more permanently than her own grieving husband had ever fully understood. That first version of the device had a critical limitation, functioning correctly only once before its underlying mechanism failed. By the time of his final confrontation with the Rick who had spent decades hunting him, Rick Prime had solved that limitation entirely, arriving with a second, fully reliable Omega device, capable of repeating the same act of multiversal erasure indefinitely. The confrontation itself, when it finally arrived, brought together an unlikely coalition. The Morty responsible for breaching the Central Finite Curve, examined in an earlier chapter of this documentary, had every reason to want nothing further to do with the Rick who had raised him. And yet, the existence of a functioning Omega device represented a threat significant enough to draw him back into an alliance neither side entered with any real trust in the other. Understanding that the device's very existence endangered him as much as anyone else, this Morty chose to remain nearby as Rick made his final approach toward Rick Prime's stronghold, accompanied by the Morty this documentary has followed from its opening chapters, who joined the pursuit against his grandfather's explicit wishes. What Rick Prime did upon finally being confronted revealed the full extent of the cruelty this documentary has been building toward across its examination of his weapon. Rather than kill his pursuer directly, he chose instead to demonstrate the Omega device's function on someone Rick loved, selecting a relative known within the family simply as Slow Mobius, and erasing every version of him across the entire multiverse in a single act, explicitly designed to inflict the maximum possible suffering on the man who had spent decades hunting him before any final confrontation between the two of them ever took place. The brutal, hand-to-hand battle that followed ended with Rick Prime incapacitated, not by the Rick who had spent a lifetime pursuing him, but by the Morty from the broken Central Finite Curve, who used the opportunity to extract the complete schematics for the Omega device directly from Rick Prime's mind and destroy his network of backup clones before stepping aside and allowing the final act of vengeance to belong entirely to the man who had earned it. What happened next closed the single longest-running thread in this entire documented history. Rick killed Rick Prime with his own hands, ending in one act a pursuit that had shaped the direction of nearly every decision examined across this documentary, from the founding of the Citadel to the particular voice chosen for a ship's artificial intelligence built years before its true significance could ever have been understood. And yet, by every available account of the moment immediately following Rick Prime's death, the resolution brought Rick no discernible satisfaction. Decades of pursuit, an entire career's worth of invention indirectly shaped by grief this documentary has traced from its earliest chapters, ended not in relief, but in a silence that suggested revenge, however completely achieved, was never actually capable of returning what had originally been lost. The unexpected consequence of this confrontation extended well beyond Rick's own emotional reckoning. The Morty who had extracted the Omega device's schematics now possessed, independently, the knowledge required to build the single most dangerous weapon this documentary has ever examined. A fact he made explicit before departing the scene. framing his possession of that knowledge less as a threat and more as a simple statement of leverage. A reminder that the balance of power this documentary's earlier chapters had assumed, settled once the Central Finite Curve was broken, had, in fact, never stopped shifting. The pursuit and destruction of Rick Prime is, perhaps, the single hardest chapter in this documentary to weigh as help or harm. It ended, permanently, the reign of a figure whose casual cruelty exceeded nearly everyone else examined in this history.
It also confirmed, with a clarity nothing before it had managed to achieve, that the entire technological arc this documentary has traced, the portal gun, the citadel, the artificial intelligence built around a borrowed voice, the decades of invention this history has attributed to curiosity and convenience, had, underneath all of it, been the output of a grief so total that an entire civilization had been reorganized around outrunning it, without ever once managing to. Vengeance solved the problem of an unpunished killer. It did not solve the problem the killer had created in the first place. And the weapon built to enact that vengeance did not disappear once its purpose was finally served. The leverage the Broken Curve's architect walked away with did not remain theoretical for long. In the period that followed Rick Prime's death, this Morty used his newly acquired knowledge to reconstruct the Omega device from scratch, an act he justified, at least to himself, as a form of deterrence rather than aggression. Rather than deploy the weapon outright, he chose instead to hold it in reserve, using its mere existence and the family's awareness that he now possessed the means to erase every one of them across the multiverse in a single stroke as a permanent instrument of quiet coercion against the very Rick who had once raised him. For a stretch of time, this documentary's record treats as one of its more disturbing periods. Rick complied, executing an unspecified series of missions on this Morty's behalf under the constant, unstated threat of what would happen to his family if he refused. The precise nature of these missions is less important, for the purposes of this history, than the underlying dynamic they represented. A weapon originally built by a figure this documentary has already established as the closest thing this civilization's history contains to an irredeemable villain had, through a chain of decisions each individually defensible on its own terms, ended up in the hands of a second figure whose own moral position had always resisted easy categorization, wielded now not against strangers, but against the family that had, whatever its dysfunctions, been the one to raise him. The arrangement eventually came apart once Morty, the grandson this documentary has followed from its opening chapters, discovered the truth of what his grandfather had secretly been enduring on the family's behalf. Rather than continue accepting the coercion in silence, Rick made a decision consistent with the pattern this documentary has traced across nearly every major crisis in his history. Rather than negotiate, rather than seek help, he acted alone and covertly, secretly destroying the reconstructed Omega device before its owner could use it again, and relocating the entire household into a specially constructed refuge known within the family's own private terminology as the bunker dimension, a defensive measure built specifically to withstand whatever retaliation this decision was certain to provoke. The confrontation that followed represented, by the account this documentary now draws on, one of the most extensive and consequential battles in the entire history it has traced, pitting Rick directly against the Morty whose transformation from a frightened, victimized child into the architect of the Central Finite Curve's collapse this documentary examined several chapters earlier. The fight demonstrated capabilities on both sides that exceeded nearly everything else covered in this history, including a healing capacity Rick appeared to have developed independently in the years since his confrontation with Rick Prime, allowing him to absorb injuries that would have ended the conflict instantly in any earlier chapter of this documentary. The battle's resolution, when it finally arrived, marked a genuine reversal of the pattern this documentary has traced since the character's earliest appearance. For the first time in a long and largely unbroken record of outmaneuvering everyone who ever opposed him, this Morty lost, decisively, and was taken into custody rather than escaping to continue his pursuit of leverage and control elsewhere in the multiverse. The significance of this reversal is worth sitting with directly, because it closes a loop this documentary has been tracing since its examination of the Citadel's earliest political structures.
The same underlying capacity for patience, calculation, and long-term planning that had once allowed a single Morty to infiltrate and eventually dismantle an entire civilization built to subordinate his kind had, over the years that followed, curdled into something closer to the very pattern of exploitation that civilization had originally been organized around, simply inverted, aimed now at the family rather than at the institution. A being who had spent his early life resisting exactly this kind of coercive control had, by the time of his final defeat, become fluent in wielding it himself. A transformation this documentary's record treats less as a simple villain's arc and more as a genuinely uncomfortable illustration of how thoroughly a system built on domination can reproduce itself, even in the very individual who once suffered most under it. The characters affected by this final chapter of the Omega device's history extend across the entire family this documentary has followed from its opening chapters. Rick, forced once again to act in secrecy rather than seek support from the people closest to him, repeated a pattern this documentary has now traced across every major crisis in his recorded life, choosing isolation over vulnerability even when the stakes involved the safety of the very people he claimed to be protecting. Morty, whose discovery of the blackmail arrangement is what finally forced the confrontation into the open, demonstrated a growing willingness to challenge his grandfather's instinct for secrecy directly, a development consistent with the slow, uneven maturation this documentary has tracked in him since his earliest appearances. The reconstruction, weaponization, and eventual defeat of the second Omega device depends heavily, for its verdict, on how the question is framed. In the narrowest sense, the family survived. The immediate threat was neutralized, and the weapon itself was destroyed before it could be used to erase anyone permanently. In a broader sense, this entire chapter demonstrates something considerably harder to resolve, a pattern this documentary has now observed across nearly every major invention it has examined. Every weapon built to solve one problem in this civilization's history has, without exception, gone on to become someone else's problem eventually, passed from hand to hand, motive to motive, until the line between the villain who first built it and the family who finally destroyed it becomes considerably harder to draw than the historical record would prefer. An inherited weapon solved the problem of leverage for the person who held it. Its destruction solved the immediate danger it posed, but it could not undo what holding that kind of power, even briefly, had already done to the person who held it. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a garage at 4 in the morning, after every other person in the house has gone to sleep and the only sound left is the low electrical hum of machines built to open doors between universes. It is worth sitting inside that silence for a moment, because it is the truest physical setting for everything this documentary has traced, more true, in its way, than any of the alien landscapes, collapsing citadels, or shattered multiversal boundaries that filled the chapters before this one. Nearly every invention examined in this history was born somewhere close to that silence, in the hours when a mind incapable of resting found itself alone with a problem it could not stop working on, whether or not the problem had ever actually needed solving. It would be simple at this point to describe Rick Sanchez as a man who traded connection for knowledge, and to leave the story there, tidy and cautionary, a warning about genius pursued too far past the point of restraint. That description would not be entirely wrong, but it would be too small for what this history has actually shown. Rick did not trade connection for knowledge so much as he tried, again and again, across every invention this documentary has examined, to build connection out of knowledge, to engineer his way back to a kind of intimacy that grief had taken from him, and that he no longer seemed to trust himself to reach any other way. The ship's intelligence speaking in a lost wife's voice, the garage assistant carrying the same borrowed cadence, an entire institution built in part out of the patient, decades-long need to find one specific person in an infinite crowd of strangers. None of this reads, on close inspection, like the behavior of a man who had given up on being known. It reads like the behavior of a man who no longer believed being known was survivable, and who built instead an elaborate architecture of substitutes, manufactured companionship, borrowed voices, cloned continuities,
all of it engineered to approximate the presence of people he could not risk losing again, because he had already lost the one version of that presence that had mattered most. This is the quiet cost this documentary has been tracing beneath every chronological chapter, and it is worth naming plainly now that the full timeline has finally been laid out. Every single invention examined across this history solved an immediate, tangible problem. The portal gun solved confinement. The Citadel solved vulnerability. The Meeseeks box solved inconvenience. The microverse battery solved scarcity. Memory storage solved unbearable recollection. Clone technology solved impossible choices. The time crystal solved uncertainty. Operation Phoenix solved mortality. Every single one of these breakthroughs worked exactly as intended, on exactly the terms it was built to satisfy. And in nearly every case, the deeper problem sitting underneath the immediate one, the isolation that made a man build a ship's brain out of a dead woman's voice rather than simply grieving her, the fear that made him hide an entire backup body from the family he claimed to trust, the pride that made him destroy a superior technology rather than admit another civilization had improved on his own, remained completely untouched. Intelligence, across this entire documented history, proved extraordinarily good at solving problems, and almost entirely unable to solve the specific problem of a man who did not know how to let anyone close enough to help him. This is, perhaps, the answer to the question this documentary has carried quietly since its opening chapter. The question of whether unlimited access to knowledge produced, for the person who possessed it, a corresponding kind of unlimited loneliness. The honest answer appears to be more precise than a simple yes. Knowledge did not cause the loneliness. The loneliness came first, seeded by a loss no amount of subsequent genius ever managed to undo. And knowledge became, instead, the material Rick reached for to build his way around it, the way another person, grieving something they could not face directly, might reach for work, or distance, or constant motion. What made Rick's version of this pattern so vast, so multiversal in scale, was simply that his particular skill set happened to include the ability to construct entire civilizations, weaponize entire timelines, and manufacture entire approximations of intimacy out of raw scientific principle. A smaller mind, carrying the same wound, might have simply gone quiet, or moved away, or kept difficult people at arm's length using more ordinary means. Rick built an interdimensional criminal underworld, a government of clones, and a ship that spoke in his dead wife's voice. The scale changed. The underlying mechanism, a man trying to outrun a grief he never let himself sit inside of, did not. It matters, in closing, to resist the temptation to flatten this into a simple morality tale about a brilliant man punished for his arrogance. The people who suffered across this history were rarely punished for arrogance in any clean, narratively satisfying sense. They suffered because they were close enough to be caught in the blast radius of someone else's unprocessed pain, repeatedly, across decades, without ever being given the full picture of what they were actually standing inside of. Beth grew up inside a father's guilt disguised as a magical playground. Morty grew up carrying memories he never consented to lose and adventures he never consented to have. An entire species of beings, manufactured across generations specifically to accompany minds like Rick's, grew up and lived and died inside a system built to keep them from ever fully understanding their own condition. If there is a genuine tragedy at the center of this documentary, it is not Rick's alone. It belongs, in different proportions, to every single person who loved him or descended from him or was simply built by him, closely enough to be shaped by a wound they never chose and could not always see. And yet, it would be equally dishonest to end this history without acknowledging what did survive across every chapter, quietly, underneath the wreckage. Morty kept returning to the garage, even after every reason he might have had to stop. Beth kept choosing, in her own complicated way, to stay tethered to a father who had built an entire pocket universe rather than simply raise her directly. Two versions of the same woman, given an impossible choice between duty and freedom, found a way to honor both rather than sacrifice either. Even the device built by the most purely destructive figure in this entire history, in the hands of the man who finally destroyed him, produced not satisfaction, but something closer to grief allowed, at last, to simply be grief, without a new invention immediately arriving to paper over it. Whatever else this documentary has traced, it has also traced a family that, against every reasonable expectation generated by the technology surrounding them, kept choosing each other, imperfectly, repeatedly, across a timeline built almost entirely out of reasons to give up on that choice. Perhaps this is the only honest note to end a history like this one on.
A civilization capable of crossing infinity never actually solved the problem that infinity exists to distract from, which is the same problem every far smaller, far less technologically advanced civilization has always faced. How to be near another person without either losing yourself in them or hiding so completely behind your own competence that they can never quite reach you either. Rick Sanchez tore open a hole between universes, built an empire on the other side of it, buried a version of his grief inside nearly every machine he ever built, and, across it all, never once discovered a formula for the one thing every single invention in this documentary was, in its own quiet way, actually reaching for. Not power, not certainty, not even survival in the end. Just the specific, unengineerable experience of being known by someone and staying. The garage light stays on a little longer than it needs to most nights. Somewhere behind it, a formula for crossing infinity sits finished, gathering dust, solved for decades. The harder equation was never in the garage at all.